in software, it's extremely difficult to define what is your defensible mechanism. But one of the, if not the most defensible asset is data. That's why like Salesforce and HubSpot are so prevalent. It's very hard to like move away from it. Like once you kind of have invested so much interest and like energy and workflows and like accumulating it. So I think within that sphere, I think it's one of the more defensible things to do.
Hello everyone and welcome to the EVN Disrupt podcast. My name is Tigran Atoyan and I'm the editor of the tech section here at EVN Report. Our guest this week was Tigran Atoyan, the founder and CEO of Haibrid, a citation curation platform. The platform currently helps writers, academics, and anyone doing research online to quickly gather sources and information to help with their research. Tigran shared with us his bigger vision for the platform and how it can eventually develop into a resource for better data management and privacy online. Thank you for listening. Tigran, thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be here.
Let's start by talking a little bit about your background. Tell us what you've been up to before starting Haibrid.
I guess going back all the way, so I was born in Armenia, grew up outside between Germany, Canada, and then moved to the UK. I guess my professional career started in the UK when I was doing my PhD. I guess I've kind of always been interested in technical topics. So actually my undergrad started in physics, then I moved to math, and I did a master's in statistics, all of that in Canada. And then my PhD kind of like gravitated more towards like probability theory with applications in finance. I was in a group where like everything was sponsored by hedge funds. It's like it was in Oxford, like close to London. So I essentially ended up being interested in that direction first, where I worked for 5 years after completing the thesis. And so 2015 to 2020, I was in like a variety of roles in trading, a couple of hedge funds, kind of different styles. It was a lot of fun, but in 2020 I decided that it was not really fulfilling. You can be good at it, you can make a lot of money, but in the end, there was not that much impact on what you do. So when my boss, who I was very close to, retired, decided to kind of jump into tech, and there was a really good opportunity to get into a fintech startup as a co-founder, essentially building what I had done. I had been building in-house for a hedge fund as a third-party product. So that was like first 2 years transit into tech. Kind of think of that as like an MBA in a way. Cheaper one. I wasn't paid for it, but at least I didn't have to like pay $200K. So and then like I also like was head of a research group in a bigger fintech afterwards, just to get experience like working in a larger tech organization. And then we basically I started Haibrid in 22, and the idea was to solve this often recurring problem that I had encountered over the last decade plus around information that kind of gets lost in the ether of people's memories and digital histories.
As you were doing your PhD, as you were in academia, was there ever a thought to just stay in academia and do research, or was because of the influence of the financial organizations and groups that were involved throughout your studies, was it always in mind to then go to industry? Or
actually had no inclination to go to industry initially, but as I was doing the PhD, I realized that maybe the academic world itself is heavily politicized itself. Politicized not like politically in the proper sense, but there's a lot of politics, meaning like in it. And maybe like I'd seen examples in my own family of, where it's like not always like the best scientist who gets the best positions, etc. So that was maybe like one part of it. And the other part is like it was a little bit slower, and maybe I just had picked a direction which was very esoteric. So the impact of what I was doing was like marginal. I'm not going to go into that. It's something around like probability theory, functional analysis, etc., which you sugarcoat as, this has many applications in, finance, etc. But at the end, if you're doing something in a field that is very old, like which is like classical probability theory, etc., are kind of the marginal impact of your contribution is little. AI would maybe be a different things. That's what I'm saying. Like it was a function of the field I was in, not
Right.
just academia.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting observation that you made about what you had seen within your own family of some of the career trajectory in academia, maybe not always being as meritocratic as one would
Well, it's
think.
got its
Perhaps,
own
yeah.
way of working, and
Yeah.
like you kind of climb the ladder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But at the pace of academia, not at your pace, right? Like
yeah.
it's hard to.
So that's why I don't want to generalize. Like, there's a lot of areas in academia which have huge impact, like AI being one of them,
For
right?
sure,
It's
Even with AI, though, it's definitely true that a lot of the fundamental work that industry is enjoying the fruits of today was done in academia, but it feels like a lot of the fundamental research has moved towards academia, but that's probably just a factor of resource allocation. It's hard to compete with the resources that a Google or Meta or OpenAI has access to.
I guess right now it's not even like very clear on like what's academia and what's not, because Google, like a lot of the top publications are from Google and Meta and
Yeah.
OpenAI, right?
And often co-authored with universities, right?
Correct. So it was like Jeff Hinton and like basically a few other people. Actually, it was in Canada that a lot of this AI boom started, like maybe 15 years, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But I was actually oddly enough not aware of it because I was much more in like pure math. But it was kind of the Montreal and Toronto were some of the breeding grounds of deep learning.
I grew up in Toronto and was also not aware of it until much later. Let's get into Haibrid. Tell us how the idea for the product came about.
Essentially, if we split kind of, I guess, well, for any founder, I think it's always good to try to solve a problem you've kind of encountered, right? And in this case, I had encountered kind of like a set of problems which seemed disjoint, but were kind of the solution, the kind of ideal solution that maybe being technical, I could have figured out was very similar. And I'll give examples. So like when I was in research in my PhD, my supervisor was very hands off. So I had to go and like research things on my own, figure out which papers to read, etc. And there you kind of realize that, this whole process is extremely inefficient, because there's a certain learning path that would have been optimal for you to let's say consume papers, content, whatever, to figure out how to tackle or understand the topic. But you have to go and like swim in this vast ocean of content, right? And how do you pick which thing to read after which? Well, in a ideal world, you could have accessed the kind of like journeys of others who've read the same thing or tried to understand the same thing, and like what did they actually find relevant in understanding this paper, right? And that thing doesn't really exist anywhere. It's kind of like it gets lost in
the ether,
in their local files, if they actually stored anything, if not in everyone's kind of like memory for your own. And so that was like the first instance of like, oh, there's like something inefficient around this, like knowledge sharing. And then second instance was when I was in trading. I was for 1 year I was looking into something very, very specific, some energy trades, which had to do with some regulation change that was coming for shipping. And every day I would go into Google News and I would go into Bloomberg, which is a very expensive tool for tracking information. But it wouldn't really give me like the right news, just because I couldn't like personalize based on what I had read before, like give me like only things on this topic. And it was kind of hard to do this with keywords, etc. I kind of would have wanted to say like, okay, like pick these 5 things I've read and then give me the most relevant things based on these 5 things. Now it seems like this is a disjointed problem from the first one I mentioned, but actually like kind of the solution around both is kind of has to do with tracking you, like kind of personalizing your content consumption journey and being able to share that, and based on that getting recommendations, using your data in a proper way, etc. And maybe the last example, and this may be pervasive across the knowledge work areas and verticals, is teams working together, right? You always kind of finding information, like using it, etc., and then you kind of map it in like Google Sheets and Drives and like links all over. But there's no like holistic way of actually kind of knowledge sharing in a personalized way. So that was kind of the 3 examples which kind of drove the insight, I guess, of what we've been trying to do.
And tell us now, like, how does that materialize into a product?
High level, it's like trying to solve a fairly maybe challenging problem where you want both transparency and personalization at the same time, because that's at the core of what's missing. Like once you have ownership of your data in a very transparent way, and you can use your data to get recommendations, to share it, etc., a lot of these problems kind of get solutions that are technically feasible. It's like, how do we enable people essentially to get agency over their data? Okay. Now, we're not the only ones who are trying to solve this problem. There's actually academic groups, etc., which have tried this.
Agency over what kind of data are we talking about?
Like digital assets. So
anything.
Most, like, it starts with your browsing history.
Mail, like messages.
Let's start with the browsing history, okay. Right? Everything else, like it's like, okay, cloud-based, your messages, etc., communication, those are other layers of communication. But for now, we're like focusing on, let's say, your content consumption, which is your browsing history to some degree. Mm-hmm. But as part of your browsing history is useful to you, a lot of it is not. So even if like Google decided that they want to leverage and like forget GDPR and CCPA and all these privacy rules and just try to leverage all your browsing history, there's a lot of garbage in it, which Google will find hard to figure out if is that garbage to you or not. Mm-hmm. Right? It's very subjective on what's relevant. So you kind of need like this, you as a human, somehow to put a mark on this isn't interesting, this is not interesting. Mm-hmm. But that's like almost like a UX UI problem. Like how do you actually, it's like a behavioral problem. Like how can I leave a little like breadcrumb for the system to figure out that this is useful? So this is like very high level, the idea. Now, like that thing, like if you go take this to a VC, nobody's gonna like fund that because
it's too abstract.
It's just very abstract, and it's just, I'm saying that's the insight of where you want to get to, right? That's kind of your let's get to Mars kind of thing, but equivalent. Maybe it's not as no,
it's okay. I like it. That's
technically thing, but like what is like the equivalent of the rocket ship you're going to build to first go to the moon, right? For that, a rocket ship is like to provide a tool for people who are actually struggling with source management to manage and like collect their sources, manage it in a way that's collaboratively shareable. Kind of thinking of like bookmarking, which is an antiquated almost technology at this stage. But bookmarking has value to specific cohorts if it's done right. So, researchers, investigative journalists, editors, marketing people, etc. And once you collect all that information, then you have all of this commoditized large language model technology that you can apply on top. But the first layer is like actually pulling all the information into a kind of easy to manage user interface. So yeah, that's kind of the rocket ship for us to get started with building something, and then you can like start kind of like trying to go beyond that.
Add more layers of abstraction to it. Yeah.
It's like starting with something like very explicit because and very tangible. Let's put it that way. Because if we say we're going to start tracking all your browsing history, and nobody's going to let us do that, right? But if we say, you know what, if you click in like this, then it's going to appear in your little dashboard, and you can annotate it. You can do this and that. That's less pervasive in terms of like privacy, in terms of trust. Mm-hmm. So you need to build that trust with your user base first. So we decided, it took a while for me, to be honest, like to figure this out. But what is the niche we want to focus on? Are we focusing on productivity? Are we focusing on content sharing? Are we focusing on a marketplace for discovering stuff? And we ended up on the productivity side to start, just because it was more tangible.
Mm-hmm. And the way the workflow works, this is one of the few podcasts I'm recording where I use the product beforehand. And it was really useful to something that I was writing over the weekend. So essentially the way, from a user perspective, you have your extension installed on Chrome. As you're doing some research, you're selecting pieces of text that are relevant to the topic that you're researching, and you're just right-clicking and saving those into your platform. And then once you're done with all your research, you go to the platform and you see the snippets from all the different sources that you visited and collected. So it was a really easy way of gathering a bunch of information, and it's definitely easy to see like the potential of how to develop this into some workflows that have more automation, that you're integrating AI into. Like one thing that I sent you an email about that would be super useful from my perspective, let's say, is like, if you take all those snippets that I did, with the citations and turn it into an outline for like a piece that I'm writing, let's say. I'm curious how you guys are thinking about AI integration into this. So like where does the LLM layer come in, and what is the LLM layer going to do with this data that's collected?
In fact, like we've started already the work on that side. So it's very obvious that, whatever you mentioned, like around an easy way to gather content and pull it together and maybe annotate it, those are like intermediate steps which don't necessarily help you with your final goal directly, right? They kind of make certain things easier. It's just like improving your maybe like your workflow that currently you might be doing with Google Sheets, reducing the number of copy pastes. There's a bunch of other like small improvements, right?
That's
around,
marginal.
Yeah, like these are all like nice to have. Some of them are like I would say good to haves. Maybe some might be even like kind of put like nice to have, good to have, great to have, must have, right?
Yeah.
And should not have. So there's some great to haves, I think, as well, even without the AI layer, which are around how do I actually annotate things on the website, and if I'm working with a colleague, that colleague will actually see next time they log into the website what I've actually mentioned. So for some people, that's already like increasing like the way that they can collaborate in a kind of like a different experience. But we're not the only ones who would do this. There's several like very good like highlighting, bookmarking tools, and Arc browser, which is great. But the whole point is like, we think of ourselves as a data company. So once you gather that data, what do you do with that data, right? And obviously there's AI is when I say AI, large language models, and in particular things like retrieval augmented generation, which is like RAG, is the number one thing you can probably think around. So I have a set of sources I've found, me and my team, let's say, have found it. Essentially, I can do either like generating content that's templated based on a format I want, and that's like very standard to do with these days. You don't need to build your own models. You just kind of plug and play into that chain of integrations. You just need to have good data to do this. There's a little bit of fine tuning that you can say is like how do you actually build your RAG? Like it's more about engineering tasks that need to be done around that. But and the other part might be also like search and retrieval. So if you have a large amount of data, and let's say if you have 100 people in your team who've like gathered data, right? How do I actually find the most relevant thing to me? So there's an aspect of essentially like a recommender system that comes in. So either like generation or recommending content from like that pool are the two, let's say, automatable tasks that kind of make a lot of sense to start with.
Recommending based on, so these snippets I've gathered from this source, the LM makes a determination that I would need relevant things that are similar or relevant to this and suggest new ones, right?
Yeah,
new
it's
sources.
like recommendation. So I'm like, maybe I'm bunching two things in one. So one is, yes, like maybe I might want to know if I'm writing a paper, what are sources similar to this that myself or others have come across. And again, I'm not a content writer,
right.
So I can't relate too much to that. But we've had a lot of user calls, and people said they would like that, for example, especially in teams. There's whole startups which are just based on that recommended part. Something called MEMAI, and was basically funded by OpenAI. Before that was Andreessen Horowitz. But they have like a very black box approach. So you dump things into a box, and then you kind of retrieve via similarity. And what these large language models have enabled, right, is well, two things. One, okay, you can query the large language model for the knowledge kind of like accumulated inside of it. But actually, the more interesting part in a lot of these models is the processing aspect of it. So it can process semantic information, meaning like it can say this thing seems like this thing, or like two pieces of text are similar or not similar. So those actions that you can do be very difficult to do 10 years ago are extremely easy to do now. So one part is that recommendation, and the other part is actually search, smart search, which actually ties in to some degree with a lot of the components that are needed to build a recommendation system. So when I say recommendation, I kind of like actually mean both. Like, do I want to pull information which is search, or do I want information pushed to me, which is a recommendation? Both really act with the same mechanism, a similar mechanism. So, but that's very different from generation, right?
Right. Right.
Maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure if my explanation was
No, that was good. So
easy enough, but I would say, generation and somehow matching content from what I care about, from my context, to a much broader pool of content where people have dumped information. How can I get the most relevant things out of that bigger pool with the most ease?
One thing that you said earlier that I thought was super interesting was like, let's say you're doing research on some scientific paper, right? Let's say you're an academic and you need to understand some paper. Dozens of PhD students have gone through your same journey of trying to understand this. And throughout it, they've had to read these 5 other papers and maybe these like other technical blog posts or something. And if it was done using your platform, you could in theory make that workflow or that like research dump shareable, and you would save subsequent people a lot of time who are researching the same thing. And maybe even some people are much better at researching it than you, and following their journey is much better than your Google searches, right? That seems like super valuable. If there was a way to incentivize people to actually share them, because by default, I don't know if I would ever like make it shareable, but it would be great if like I could rely on. So I would love to rely on someone else's like workflows that they've shared.
I guess the idea is actually structurally quite similar to like sharing things with a team, except here you would share with the community, right? It's more challenging though. In a community versus like a team, you don't really have a very defined context.
Yeah.
In a team, you have, let's say, what I mean by context is, I don't know, let's say you're working on a project, you have a specific output, and if you see a link that a colleague has shared, you kind of know why they've shared it, right? Where it fits in. Whereas
that's a great point.
if you have thousands or hundreds of thousands, or if you have the whole world sharing into like a research repo, all the biologists in the world, right? Okay, well, it's a huge dump, which then needs to be almost like parsed in a way that makes sense to you as a person who's going to end up like consuming part of that content. And before getting there, there's a few steps of technology that need to be built. It's within the broader let's go to Mars strategy. Let's put it that way. But it fits within the broader ethos of like, let's get people, let's call it ownership or transparency of like the data they have, enable them to share that data, and then have I guess automation or AI is kind of the digital librarian that kind of assists, saying like, okay, well, we have all these things. That's where the recommendation system comes in. You might want to check this. But here, what we're saying in terms of like the academic thing is actually a little more involved. It's more around, you almost want a playlist.
Exactly.
And there you don't want to trust the AI system, no matter how good it is, to actually give you that playlist directly. So you probably would get more benefit if you have a human somehow doing most of the work of like, not work, but somehow having them say, okay, well, these are like 5 things I've come across which are the most relevant. Maybe like give an order or whatever, and then dump that. So there's a certain sequencing of the steps you need to get to. And that's, again, it relates to building playlists. We're not focusing on that now, but it's kind of some of the things you can do once you have that data.
Yeah. What about in terms of generation tasks? Is that something you guys are looking to integrate into the platform?
Yeah, we're when you say generation tasks, meaning
like the outline idea I mentioned.
Yeah, that's the first thing. So the recommendation side is something we're like experimenting around. One of our key investors and advisors, like he used to lead the recommendation system team at Shopify. So we've had long conversations with him. He's like a friend from 20 years ago. Almost like not a passion project, but it's a direction that we know is worthwhile, but it takes more work to build that than the generation part.
Right.
Just because the LLM world is so commoditized now, it's like very easy to
do
plug and play rack system.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about this bigger vision of a world where there's transparency around your data usage, and you can decide how it's being shared with a larger platform like I don't know, like a Google or something of the world, and how that's being used to provide you these recommendations and stuff. How do you envision it going from this essentially like not citation is not the right word, but like this knowledge curation, not any curation is the wrong word too, knowledge collection platform into something where you now have all of your preferences and data and stuff in here, and you're in control of how it's being used. How do you get from this to Mars?
So I mean, there's like several parts, right? Like let's go to the moon first, right?
Okay.
So number one, it's a function of the amount of data you pull in, right? And your history, let's say if you think of your digital history, it contains a lot of, again, like the idea is like it contains a lot of garbage, it contains a lot of some information you want. So there's a lot of noise in the signal, right? That might be relevant to you. So the first aspect is, okay, well, let's start with manually like actually liking content, essentially like saving content. But then you want to start gradually moving towards automating the way that you gather the content.
Okay.
Because then that increases the scope of how much data you've actually collected. And basically, as you're collecting more content, you're going to need better systems to filter and classify the content and categorize it, right? I think when
this is around like everything. So not just like I'm doing research on this topic.
So I mean, there's a lot of things that we haven't obviously like fully resolved. Like we've thought about some of it, but the idea is like you have several modes. You have several personas in a way in your digital history, right? And you have different contexts in which you work. And figuring out, you know, which data pertains to which context and how do you actually build the user interface to enable a human to very easily toggle between them and not make their browsing experience more complex. If anything, you want to make it simpler. I think it just takes a lot of experimentation around the user interface. And the first step was like just build the easiest browser extension you can for like starting to like content. And then after that, you know, there's a few, like, I don't want to say yet what, because we haven't fully launched that, but there's ways that we're thinking around starting to gather content beyond just manually like clicking like on this. You kind of like via opt-ins, etc., and maybe working with even like some content like platforms in terms of like gathering content that you've come across. So there's like several strategies that we have in like essentially trying to increase the volume of information that comes in. That's obviously where like bookmarking kind of fails because you
want to bookmark a lot of those personas, as you put it, are not bookmarkable.
Yeah, it's like it's more about like if you bookmark something, you might remember it. And these days, it's very easy to search for things, right? If I want to remember something, like if I have the 5 keywords, I might be able to like easily find it. So just bookmarking on its own doesn't add that much value. I think the way for us to actually kind of break the mold, let's say, of this is enable more content than just like simple bookmarking to be collected and then vetted, and B, have this collaborative aspect where I can share some of that space to some other, whether it's work, colleague, whatever, friends, because we're working now with professional use cases. So it's going to be sharing that with your team in like workspaces, just like Notion and other frameworks. But I can say like, what's the next few steps? I would say like projecting every step is, you know, it's like, there's no like huge like master plan on that. I think it's around a lot of experimentation on the user interface. Yeah.
And I guess you guys have your plate full with perfecting the workflow on this first persona that you guys have started with.
Yeah. And I think the way that we need to do it is like, you both have your direction that you want to get to, covering more content than just all this manual stuff, and being able to share that not just for work, but also potentially for learning.
Yeah.
And at the same time, really focusing on the use cases that we have.
Yeah.
Being very meticulous in picking the right kind of segments that we work with, so that we don't get trapped into building something that is so specific that it's going to be like only useful for like one cohort.
Yeah.
That's why we found that investigative researchers were like a really good use case. Again, they don't have a lot of money to spend on tools necessarily compared to consultants and like finance, etc. But their requirements are very generic.
Right.
I think that's why we kind of thought this would be a very good way to start. I would say, and we're the final point is like, I think for us, we need to be extremely UX centric, meaning user research and just listening to the requirements
The
of
feedback you're getting.
not the features they want necessarily, but you know, what are the things what are the problems, the needs, etc. for your audience, and how can you solve that in the most effective way?
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I'm curious, as a founder, your background is in academia and then finance and these very like technical roles. How do you transition from that into being someone, it's very, very clear that you think very deeply about product, you think about what the roadmap is going to look like, not just for a 1 year time frame, but this like go to orbit, moon, and then Mars type of thing. How do you pick up those skills? How do you develop that as a founder?
Just talk to the smartest people you can find. And then that's I think very generic advice, but not just talk to them, but maybe like even like when I was in academia, I was just very fortunate to be around an extremely bright group of people, like even within the schools and whatever, they were like, they're just like better than me in a way, which was great because then you can like pick things up from them. So in terms of like getting well-rounded, maybe that's like part of it. I would say it's like very personal. So if, you know, in some cases you will have co-founders who will pick up certain parts, right? In my case, I kind of have to do a bit of everything, but that's just because I like multitasking, learning. And I think that came from trading actually, because trading kind of makes you a little bit ADHD, I think.
Yeah.
You have to
You're
build a
scattered.
system, you have to always monitor things. So you're like, your attention is like shifting easily between one to another. I would say it's very personal, but it always like comes with like this kind of drive to find the best people you can surround yourself with.
So product aptitude is learnable.
I think so. I think it's just you need to find something you're passionate about.
Yeah. Well said. Last question. 5 years from now, where do you hope to see Haibrid?
So we should probably like, we don't talk much about it outside of the group, but I would say the idea with Haibrid was just to be, okay, what is the most ambitious thing we can try to solve within the skill set and confines that we have, right? And I would say within 5 years, we're building this rocket ship. So, you know, getting to Mars might be overly ambitious in 5 years, but let's say getting to the moon. Might as well moon in 5 years.
Yeah.
So what does moon mean? It means like you would have built a very good tool that is being used by several knowledge verticals, not just like media and like journalists. And at that point, you kind of want to be thinking more around, okay, is there like actually a broader consumer direction you can think around? So I think 5 years kind of makes sense in that timeline.
I said last question, but let me add one more thing. So there's a lot of talk about whether or not these companies that are being built around integrating just LLMs or some sort of AI technology that the company itself has not built and improving some workflow or creating some workflow from scratch. There's a lot of talk about whether or not these are sustainable businesses, because you're always kind of at the mercy of the next model iteration coming out and it rendering your workflow meaningless because the model can do that with zero prompting or something. In your case, because you are collecting data that is personal to the user, you have an advantage that the model on its own might never have. Is that something you see as enough to build a defensible business around something where the tech is not your own?
I think like these days, I'll give you an example. So my brother, he's in hard tech. So he has a startup and they've been building something for 7 years. So there you have a defensible business because it takes so long to build that, right? And it takes like very specific skill set. So in software, it's extremely difficult to define what is your defensible mechanism. But one of the, if not the most defensible asset is data. That's why like Salesforce and HubSpot are so prevalent. It's very hard to like move away from it. Like once you kind of have invested so much interest and like energy and workflows and like accumulating it. So I think among that space, within that sphere, I think it's one of the more defensible things to do, because even OpenAI is not, the only way they're staying ahead is like running ahead of like Google and Anthropic and all these other companies, which can take over. Like look at like Mistral, within like a year and a half, they built something that's like competing,
But,
right?
yeah, but they're doing it by building the model, right?
Yeah, but that's like extremely expensive to stay in that race, right? So you don't want to be in that race. I don't think any smaller company, it's like political. Yeah. It's essentially political, right? So if you're a smaller company, like what's your way to kind of figure out like what's your moat? And for us, it's data, as you mentioned it. So you're very well, basically, you have the right perspective around it.
Yeah.
So maybe the final point is like you want to build something that, you know, the better the models get, the better the value of your product.
Yeah, there was this great quote from one of the VCs, I can't remember which now, but they said something like, the founders with the best ideas are excited about what GPT-5 will bring and not scared of it. Yeah. Easier said than done, but I agree that you almost have to be able to answer that question by saying, yes, I'm excited by how GPT-5 improves this application that I'm building. Yeah. And not, oh my God, GPT-5 is going to render me obsolete. Because even if GPT-5 doesn't, GPT-6 will, or 7 or whatever, right? So it's like those ones have a shelf life, obviously. Whereas hopefully if it's something that, as you put it, like there's some data unique to your platform. By platform, I at the user level, obviously. By using your platform, there's some data that the LLM is utilizing that is unique to me and giving a response that I won't get from just the LLM. Then at that layer, there's clear differentiation and value that I can't get from OpenAI or Anthropic or some other platform. Yeah, but it's super interesting space, and I think that conversation about how do you build defensible companies by integrating AI tech built by the big players is like something we talk about for hours. So at some point, as this conversation matures, I hope you'll come back on and we'll talk about it again. But
maybe like last point, I'm not sure I should. Well, I'm saying like for us also, we want to build like a version of the product that's again like free to use for individuals. So just any one of your audience who wants to try it.
Tell them where they can go to try it.
app.hybrid HAIBRID.ai. So that's the way to kind of go and sign up. You can also, I don't know, you can share, I'm not sure if you share like contact details or whatnot, but we're very open to kind of getting feedback and messages from,
where can they reach an
audience. You can reach at Tigran at Haibrid HAIBRID.ai.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, Tigran. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.
Of course.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergey.